Hello! In this tutorial, we'll be making a simple multiplayer dice game. The rules of the game are simple. Each player rolls a die on their own computer, and whoever gets the higher number wins. If there's a tie, they'll both re-roll their dice. Of course, our dice are virtual, so they will be calculated using a random number generator. But both players will see their results visually as the side of a die. Before we begin, we need to discuss some challenges with coordinating the two players. The players in this program will send messages back and forth to control the flow of the game. Either player will be able to start the game, and the game needs to behave properly regardless of who started it. One issue that may arise is that latency in the network between players may cause a delay in displaying the result of the game. In this case, the player will simply have to be patient. In a more complex game, it could be very annoying for a player if they have to deal with latency. In NetsBlox, we can communicate by passing messages between users. These messages must be given a predefined structure with a name so that the receiver can recognize them and a set of values or fields to be sent with each message. Before we start writing a distributed program, it's good to determine the message types we'll be using. For the dice game, we'll be using two message types. The first will tell the other player that we wish to start playing a game. This will signal both players to roll their virtual dice. Once they've determined their random values, they need to let the other player know what they rolled. For this, we'll need to use a second message type to send the result over. Now let's put together our NetsBlox project. First, we'll need to make a die sprite that can roll to any face. To do this, we'll need to set up a sprite with 6 costumes, one for each side of the die. You can draw your own faces in the editor, or we have provided a compressed file with a set of pre-made images. There's a link in the description. For this project, add these costumes to the default sprite the project came with. This will allow us to display a result visually instead of only through text. Make sure that you have the faces in the correct ascending order, or you'll end up with a very confusing result in the end where the rolled result is not properly displayed in the die. Next, let's create the two message types we need for the project. Under the network category, choose Make a Message Type. For the first one, let's call it Start. Click the left arrow to remove the default field. When we start the game, we don't need to tell the other player anything other than that we wish to start playing. Now let's create our second type. The second type we'll call Roll, and we'll give one field to it, which we'll also call Roll. This will store the result of a dice roll. Now that we have both message types created, we can make code that runs in response to them. Before putting our code together, let's make a variable. We'll want it to store the random number we generate, so we can use it in multiple places. If we reuse the pick random block, we'll get different results each time. If we used a script variable, we wouldn't be able to use it in multiple locations in our program. Create a new variable and let's call it dice. In our sprite, add a when I receive block from the network category. Set it to activate on the start message type. Now we'll add a set size 2 from the looks category and set the size of the sprite to 50%. This is optional, but it will make the project look nicer when using the provided sprites because they're very large. After this block, add a set variable to block from the variables category. Use this block to set the dice variable to a value received from the pick random block in the operators category, with a minimum value of 1 and a maximum of 6. So now when the game starts, we'll be getting a random dice roll for ourselves. However, that's only half the game. We also have to send it to our opponent and compare it to their value. We'll also need to display our value. To do this, we'll just add a switch costume to block from the looks category. If we use the dice variable as the costume number to switch to, it'll switch to the costume for whatever we rolled. Finally, we'll need to use a send message block from the network category to send a roll message with the value we rolled to others in the room. Next, we're going to handle the roll message. If we receive this message, it means the other player rolled their die and is sending us the value we want to compare our value to. So there's three possibilities here. Our roll could be higher, which means we win. Our opponent's roll could be higher, which means we lose. Or both rolls are the same and we need to re-roll. Let's add another when I receive block and set it to activate on the roll message. First, we'll separate out the case when there's a tie. We'll want to add an if-else block from the control category and an equality comparison from the operators category. We want to see if dice, which stored the value that we rolled, is equal to roll incoming from the message that we received. If they're equal, we'll need to do the same things we did for the start message. We need to set the dice variable to a random number between 1 and 6, switch to the right costume, and then send a roll message to the others in the room. We also would like to add a say block so we can tell the users that there was a tie. In the else part of this block, which means it wasn't a tie, so either we won or we lost, we don't need to re-roll, we'll need to determine first who won and who lost. So there's two possibilities here, so we can use another if-else block to decide between them. The condition for this if-else should be if our value, dice, was greater than the roll value of the incoming roll. Both sections of this if-else will just tell us what the result was. So add a say block to both the if and the else, using a join block to include the values that were rolled by each player. The game is almost playable at this state. There's only one thing missing, which is that nobody actually sends the start message to begin with. We can't play the game if nobody actually starts it. So add a when green flag is clicked from the control category, and beneath it add a send message to block from the network category. Have it send a start message to everyone in the room. So now when we click the green flag, once the other player is in the game will play as expected. Now we need to actually create our second player. We'll be taking advantage of NetsBlox's room features, and we'll be setting up a second role. Roles in NetsBlox allow us to provide different variations of our program to different users based on how they are expected to interact with our program. For example, a Pong game could have one role for the right paddle and another for the left. They may have some code in common, but their code will be slightly different, and each player will receive specialized code for their situation. This also creates an easy way to determine which player is in control of which parts of the game. However, our dice game, both players have the same role effectively, but we will be making them two separate roles, one for each player. The code will be the same as they perform the same actions. In the Room tab, we can see the roles present in our program. We can also switch between them and invite another user to join our session. By default, there's a My Role role present in our program. If you click on its name, we can rename it. Let's call it Player 1, which makes more sense than My Role. The second role will have the same code as the first role, so we can duplicate the first role to create it. Click on the circle for the first role, be careful not to click on its name, and then choose to duplicate it. This will create a new role named Player 1 2. Let's click on that name and rename it to Player 2. Changing the name isn't necessary, but it does make your program much better organized and easier to understand. At this point, the program is actually complete, you just need a second player to play it. If you have a second player next to you, make sure they're logged into NetsBlox with their account and have it open in the browser on their computer. They just need the editor open, they don't need your specific project open. If you don't have a second player with you right now, don't worry, you can still play. Just open a second browser window on any computer, even the same one you're on, and open the NetsBlox editor there. And make sure you're logged in. In the Room tab, click the role with empty beneath it. Now we can choose to invite a user. If you're playing with someone else, choose their username. A window will pop up on their screen offering for them to join your game. If you're playing against yourself, choose Myself, which isn't a user named Myself, it refers to yourself, and accept the invitation in your other browser window. Now you should have one player in each role and you can start the game. To run around in the game, just have one of the players click the green flag icon. The messages will automatically pass back and forth between both of you to determine the outcome of the game. Let's discuss a few ways you could extend this project. One way is by adding some animation to it. When you roll a die in real life, it jumps around a few times, you see different faces on top, it doesn't immediately jump to the result. However, a program right now, you run it and it just jumps to where it landed. That's not as much fun as if it bounced around the screen for a bit. So you could create a variation of this program where the die jumps around the screen randomly, showing different faces as it moves. This could also be used to disguise any latency if you have it bounce around while it waits for the other player to respond. Another possible extension would be to display both players' results on screen at once. Normally we only see our own result and the text tells us what the other player rolled. If you use the provided dice costumes or created your own with a color on them, you can use the Set Color Effect block under Looks to create different colored dice to display as the opponent. A third variation on this program you could do is to add a score system. Right now it only keeps track of one game at a time. Once you click the green flag, it forgets any past games ever happened. Well, that's nice for a simple example program. If you want to make this a much better game, it'd be nice to have a score system so you can see who won more times out of you and your friends. Really, it's just keeping track of who has better luck, but it still makes the program feel more complete. You also could use it to test how balanced the random number generator is. Because neither player has any specific advantage, you would expect it to come out with an even number of wins for both of you. You can also add extra players to the game, and this can tie in with showing multiple dice and keeping score as well. However, the code will require some modifications to wait for everybody to roll their dice before declaring a winner. You'll also likely need to change the roll message so it keeps track of who is rolling, not just what the result was. A final variation on this program you could implement would be to resolve one small or possibly large flaw with this program. Both players are blindly trusting each other to roll fairly. If you modified the code in your program so that when you roll the die, it always comes up a 6, you would always win. And the other player's program would have no idea that you were cheating. You could modify the program to keep track of dice rolls to see if anything is coming up disproportionately. There's some complicated math that would allow you to ensure that it's fair with only two people who don't trust each other, but there's another solution. You could add a third roll to the program. This would have to be filled in by somebody you both trust, not to cheat for either one of you. But how the program would work then is when either player wants to roll, they tell the third person to roll for them, and then send the result to both players. But of course, this requires a trusted third party. You can see even with this very simple program, trust can be very difficult in the digital world.